Panworks, bringing ethics to life.
Joanne, do you want to?
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to compliment you. The World Health Organization's definition of health is only applied to people, but I have been applying it to other
me too.
animals for years.
Yep.
Good. I really like that. I really like that. But then I want to read you what animal welfare is to the American Veterinary Medical Association, which has more than 100,000 veterinarians. Not everybody belongs. I gave up my membership last year, but here's their definition of animal welfare. Good animal welfare requires disease prevention, veterinary treatment, appropriate shelter, management, nutrition, humane handling, and humane slaughter. And what Gretchen and I have argued in making that distinction between welfare and well-being is that welfare, the way that the organization, which is hugely influential and is also in bed with big pharma, big ag, and all of that, they think of it as whatever we give animals. I think you made that point earlier.
Right.
We give them something, and therefore, because we've given them all these great things, they have good welfare. But I think your point was that well-being is, I don't know that we can know what well-being is, or I certainly think that the measures we have are completely inadequate, even if there's some agency. So, I just want to say that unfortunately is the definition that the American Veterinary Medical Association uses. And one of the things that I'm most concerned about or most passionate about is changing that among the 100,000 plus veterinarians in this country. But with that definition, and honestly, the way veterinarians are taught in veterinary medical school, they lose their ethics. They get ethics in their first year, and then they totally lose it. Well, first of all, the ethics is insufficient. But as they go to their fourth year, they accept a lot of things that they would not have accepted as first year students. That bothers me. And with the AVMA sitting on top of the whole thing, with that definition, how do we change? I mean, they're such a powerful group, and they really define what our responsibility is to animals, at least in the United States and probably elsewhere. So that's something that how do we change? I don't know how to change that. Anyway, that's my frustration.
Yeah. And I share that frustration.
Yeah. Anyway, okay, I'm done.
Robin?
My question, when I was looking at the slide with the circle of considerations for well-being, I kept coming back to the question of if we're placing well-being based on at least a minimal understanding of the experience of the animal or some aspect of their own well, how do we do that? How does it protect the species that we really can't fathom their experience, the ones that are so different to us that historically it's been assumed, probably very wrongly, that they don't experience pain and suffering and all those things. So how does it protect
any
them?
Certain animals in mind, Robin? Or
I mean, all of the invertebrates come to mind as an easy start.
Well, even with invertebrates, we have. So, one of my habits is I make flaws. I don't know, is I qualify my qualifications. So bear with me. So I sort of trip over myself because I'm always like, well, actually, what about? So what I was going to get at is we do have a fair bit of knowledge that's developed about invertebrates. Barbara mentioned, the spiders, and we have a lot more understanding of their cognitive abilities, including, like Barbara rightly pointed out, personality, and that I anecdotally observed when I was doing my research. And that's true for, crustaceans, and their ability to suffer and experience pain and all of that. And so it's, and this goes back to me, quote unquote, the science isn't in yet, right? And that's often used as an excuse, a pass, what have you, to either not do something or well, we could just still do it because we don't know. And that's certainly true for a lot of invertebrates, and certainly with the advent of insect farming, right? That's happening as a protein replacement. I'm just starting to see some articles, some public things being published about the welfare of those insects, but I mean, and maybe Brandon can speak to this as a journalist, if Brandon has come across anything on that topic. But this is where the ethics leading the research, right, is so important, because just because we may not know or may not think we know, it doesn't, again, speaking for myself, it doesn't mean we oh well, then we should continue to, or until we get the knowledge, right? Like, oh, we pain don't experience, fish don't experience pain, so we're just going to keep doing the horrible things that we do to fish, and on the scale that we do it to them, and we know fish experience pain and suffer, and the flip side of that is they experience positive emotions as well. We just don't grant them that often. So that's kind of my short answer to you, Robin, is about when we don't know. And when it comes to a species that we're just distantly related to, compared to other species such as a primate or whatever, that we can almost intuit, right, connections, and an understanding. I think we just need to expand the way we relate to the world. We need to hone our senses, and I think we have the ability to do that. And there's studies to show that we, as humans, with the development of human culture, those senses have been sort of dulled over time, right? But studies are showing that we still possess, right, biologic ability to understand other species, even those that we're distantly related to. We oftentimes interpret accurately affective states.
I just want to jump in and highlight, there's a paper I read recently that put it nicely, and they talk about, most science currently has an epistemological based ethic. So that is, our ethics are based on the knowledge that we gain, and we won't change our ethic until we get the information that says a fish feels pain. And
right.
That's really sort of bad, I think. And then they suggest moving towards an ethics-based epistemology, so that we start with our ethics and let that inform the knowledge that we try to gather.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Adam.
Chris?
Well, first of all, I really appreciated how you engaged us in sort of in the middle of your talk, because that's the way I teach. It's like, I've got to feed off other students' questions. I can't just keep, and so it's just my teaching approach. But so my question is, at the very beginning, you had a slide up of your work with the elephants in Thailand, and your concern about how to study conservation or engage in conservation without interfering with their lives. And I thought, wow, I mean, talk about that's a real something. So anyway, my question is, can you talk a little bit more about how an ethics-based science or a well-being approach might affect the way that we do study animals and their well-being? I mean, how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, and actually that thanks, Chris, and that reminds me of what the other point I wanted to mention during your question, Robin, was the fact that, and I'm culpable of it too, is that I use knowledge that was collected unethically about animals. I mean, that's still the vast majority of the way we acquire, information. I've been working to try and not cite studies that violate sort of my ethical thinking. But it's very difficult, sometimes near impossible, depending upon what you're writing about and trying to convey. But that also gets to your point, Chris, about that the pursuit of knowledge, right, oftentimes trumps the way in which we acquire that knowledge, even when we're acquiring knowledge about empathy in a primate, right? And show, oh my God, or rats have empathy. But does that change how we treat those animals, that they're still in captivity, they're still seen as research subjects? No, and there's always a call for more research at the end of all of those papers. And yes, part of that is driven by, conventions in in publishing and so forth. But it's really, you can see that there are these entrenched conventions that are, if we're not really working to fight against, we just, we're all guilty of perpetuating those things. But I would say, Chris, that it very much should change the way we do science and the way we conduct research. We shouldn't be able to ask whatever we want to ask and find out answers to those questions in whatever way we want to find them out in, because it's easier or it's more cost effective or what have you. There should be real, again, speaking for myself and my approach to this, there should be real constraints on what we can do, and what we can do to other animals. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with, if that means we don't know, then we don't know, right? I don't need to know, you think about, and that, think about how we would treat humans. We treat humans terribly. So it's not like we're great within our own species, but there are certain regulations and laws in place for that basic protection, that we don't have for the majority of animals in the world. And I think we should be comfortable with, that it's okay not to know. And maybe this is a bit of a tangent, but it relates to me in that, like, I think about access to animals, this idea that humans, should have access to animals in whatever way we want access to animals. Like, oh, I want to be able to see these species. Well, I should be able to go to a zoo and see all of those species, regardless of what this means for those animals. No, I don't think we all deserve access, when it's at the cost of the lives of these other beings. So we need, as a species, we need to be okay, with that, the discomfort that comes with those very reasonable constraints.
Yes, thank you.
Stephen.
So I just wanted to first of all, second the appreciation for, giving us a chance to have a discussion during your presentation. And I actually timed it, and it was exactly the length of time that you went over. So it's all good.
Thank you. Oh, Stephen, you hear that, Bill?
Bill knows. Bill is going to be like, no, not true, but just throwing it out there. So coming from a zoo and aquarium background, I know that the AZA has recently shifted the way it talks about animal welfare to talk about animal well-being. And I'm curious, like, to what extent is that comparable to how you were talking about it, and to what extent is that just coincidental?
Yeah. It's come later. I heard about the change from people working in that space, in the zoo world, and got a chance to ask some questions about why the change and what it meant, and beyond just the language that's on the websites and things like that. And I don't think I'm speaking out of turn, but I still will. I'm not going to mention names, of course, and I'll be a little bit careful. But from my understanding, the use of well-being in the AZA, for example, is to help humans relate to the animals, right? So and this is really interesting, you know, in the sense like, and this shows, right, that separation between humans and other species. Like, well-being is good for us, but we need a different term for other animals, right? Similar to our autopsies or necropsies, you know, go on down the line, right? And so yeah, it seemed to stem largely from a way to help people relate to the to an understanding of welfare, and then I think perhaps the other elements came after that, in the more meaningful things about what does that mean for the animals themselves. But I think it was largely driven by yeah, a terminology.
Yeah, just let me jump in there. A lot of that is driven by another think tank that I'm a part of called Knology, which has deep connections
Okay.
in the zoology world, through John Fraser, who's a conservation psychologist. And there was a whole series of of surveys done of zoos, of zoological adjacent organizations and think tanks like Knology about this, and well-being was one of those terms that came up. Interestingly, it came up as part of the arguments we were making against sort of the welfarist ambassador animal approach, which weren't recognizing the importance of animal personhood. So you have these ambassador animals who are pulling in people, and they're concerned about them, but they didn't want to acknowledge their personhood, their intrinsic value, and of course the ethical dimensions that Liv is so articulate about. So that's just a little background, which fleshes out a bit of what Liv's talking about.
Well, I'll go a step further and say even before that, there was a national survey done paid for by the Animal Welfare Committee of the AZA that actually asked a representative sample of the American public to, well, tried to get at how they related to the terms animal rights, animal welfare, and animal well-being. Essentially, which ones they preferred, which ones they resonated with them as better terms. So there was a marketing angle that was done in 2004. You might remember, Bill, you and I talking about the questions that we should put on that survey.
Barbara.
Well, first of all, Liv, thank you so much. I thought it was just magnificent to hear you talking about how we have to push back against this science isn't in claim, which is so disingenuous. I mean, I'm sure you're highly aware that most people don't talk about this in relation to invertebrates. So that was just, fantastic. Last month was an International Day of Protest against the planned octopus farming in Spain, and I contributed to that, and it's become a global movement because there's going to be 1 million octopus farmed if this goes through. So thank you. One comment and one question. I thought your shift in language was also super important in going from welfare to well-being and talking about things like flourishing, animals' richness of life, and similar terms. Hope Ferdowsian and my other colleagues and I write about that and say, how can we think of allowing animals to experience the full dimensions of their lives, and to underscore the importance of that shift in language? Because I think that in the old language with like 5 freedoms, when choice and control are talked about, it's usually choice about, well, you go outside a cage or inside, something really simplistic. And what you're talking about and what we're talking about,
it's the illusion of choice. It's what you give to a child, to, right. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. A very sort of condescending thing. And that what we want to talk about is real choice in terms of what happens to one's body at a fundamental level. And so that brings me to a question. I really liked your slide with the non-agentic living in one end and then, the sort of stepwise. Okay, so we can just envision that slide for a minute. As you were talking, I noticed that you frequently use the phrase, here life is not worth living, and we work up to a life that's worth living. And I got to thinking about that a lot. And I got to thinking about it in terms of analogies with language that's used in the human disability community. And I just wondered, is there a risk of being anthropocentric, in our thinking? Like, what's a life worth living?
Well, that's why I was like, you might think of it, that I was careful, Barbara, in that. So a life worth living is, obviously that phrase has been around for a long time, and it has different connotations in different spaces, religious, spiritual, etc., etc. But it's also used in the 5 domains. So David Miller uses it, and it's never sat entirely well with me. I've used it as a shorthand here and there, but for other reasons, but not dissimilar to what you're getting at. I'm uncomfortable with it. So, and that is why I just sort of referred to it, because I thought maybe there might be some of you in the group that's what you've heard, and are more familiar with. But so I stopped you short. So I want you to, get at your full statement, but I just wanted to,
Okay, I understood that you were using a historically sort of, popular term, but I wasn't as clear on your own critique of it.
Well, right, because I wasn't going to get.
I just wanted to ask if you could talk about that just a bit. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think for a life worth living, or a life not worth, especially the life not worth living, but it extends to a life worth living, I think can be problematic, because that gets at, that becomes paternalistic, and that gets, I think, at your point about disability rights, right? That who am I to say to this individual, whether you're human or non-human, that this is a life you do or don't want to live, right? So I'm undermining my own point about agency and autonomy and choice and control, right? And so that's why I use agentic and non-agentic instead, to really elevate that it's the animals, the individuals, who are the agents, and are the centers of their own lives, and should be making that choice of, even to say, is this worth living or not? And for example, I shouldn't make that assessment. Does that
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I more or less assumed that must have been what you felt. I just wasn't sure that I was hearing it, and I don't know.
I was sort of skirting around that, but
thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, because I've used it, the life worth living, as, like I said, as shorthand, but always, because it's just, kind of currency, but always uncomfortable about it. Not uncomfortable for, in part, the reasons that you brought up, but uncomfortable because of, again, it in and of itself, it just feels like it's, sort of undermining the very essence of what I'm trying to achieve. Yeah.
Very important point. I know that I'm hearing that exchange right there is going to alter how I talk about life worth living. That's for sure. Tristan.
Thanks very much, Liv. Great talk. And I was also really interested in the way you were talking about that spectrum of non-agentic to agentic life. And I also heard that phrase, a life worth living, and it really gave me pause. It made me think about Derek Parfit, the British philosopher, and his ideas about what he called the repugnant conclusion. So I'll leave you to go and look up that if anybody hasn't read it. Right. But it's very interesting, where he basically says that if you're a utilitarian of a particular sort, then you must conclude that having many extra people living, a life that is barely worth living is actually a good thing. But what I really wanted to get at was to ask you about counterfactuals. So often in these discussions, a counterfactual is hovering in the background. And apologists for, high intensity farming, factory farming, or animal research will often
assume, oh, it's better than not being alive at all. Or, we're, as someone put it, we're giving them so much already. Look, they've got comfortable bedding, and they're free from predation, and, they live without fear, and all of these good things that they've got.
Yeah.
But hovering in the background is this counterfactual, which is sometimes assumed to be, well, it's better than being not alive at all. But it seems like you're kind of pointing to a different counterfactual, and I wondered what it was.
Oh, what do you think it is, Tristan? I'm really, I'm kind of
Well, I mean,
curious
maybe
because I don't know.
you
I
kind
don't know if I know.
I don't know, maybe you alluded to it when you asked us where we thought some animals, which animals we thought might fit within David Fraser's, three spheres of good living, or whatever he called it.
Yeah.
And, often the life of a wild animal is kind of used as a counterfactual, and I think that's actually a really interesting one, because yes, while they suffer disease and so forth and predation, and they have a lot of freedom and freedom of choice and a very rich and interesting life. So in some ways their lives are very good. But I guess we're mostly talking about animals that are used for research and animals that are used for farming and pets and so forth. So most of the animals in the world, vertebrates in the world rather, are in those sorts of situations. So yeah, just wondered if you had thought about, are you comparing the life of the animals we're talking about here, the subjects of research in particular, with some ideal life?
So yeah, so a lot of thoughts come to mind. So when I was a kid, I used to have these radical, I guess, would you call them fantasies of like, to save all the animals in factory farms, that I would humanely, I would euthanize them, that I had this ability to just put them all to sleep in the world. So at least then I thought, it's not, being in those conditions, just being alive that's not enough necessarily. It's certainly in those conditions. But I mainly study wild animals, right? I'm not really, I don't spend a lot of time studying animals in captive settings, in medical research, or not in the lab or anything like that. So like this work really sort of came out of my research with free living wild animals, right? With jumping spiders, with the kangaroo rats, with the elephants, and lots of other animals in between. So to me, I'm going to wend my way to maybe an answer, and maybe I won't answer, Tristan. So you might have to get me back on track, and feel free to do that. But to me, that like this work about animal well-being is absolutely applicable to the world of wild animals and free living wild animals. And thinking about, so what are the elements that lead to, a high state of well-being, for example. One, that's dynamic. And, secondly, it's also going to vary, and I know I have a bias towards personality, towards individual variations, seeing animals as individuals, but it's really important because it's also going to vary based on who those animals are. They do have different perspectives. They have different genetic predispositions. They have different lived experience, different embodied knowledge. And all of that affects how they themselves see the world and how they weight different aspects of their lives against other things. And so, in the wild, there's going to be, for certain animals, a lot of risk, a lot of threat out there, maybe a threat to, risk of predation. But to me, that doesn't outweigh all of the other aspects of their life, right? And who those animals are, it's going to affect them differently. And the other thing that's, I think, really important is, and this actually my understanding or appreciation of this has come out of my time with the elephants is about reasonable compromises, right? And trying to understand what is a reasonable compromise for us, for other animals, because we exist in a world of compromise, right? Compromise is good. None of us gets our way all the time, nor should we get it, nor do we know what we might even want if we got it, you know, etc. And so other animals are making those compromises too. And so, you know, and that's also why I, you know, there's this focus, this hedonic focus in animal welfare science or in wild animal, you know, welfare. You know, it really focuses on, it's a hedonic model, right? So fear from fear, you know, freedom from fear, you know, freedom from distress, you know, it's either or. And it's, so if you're not happy, you're suffering. If you're not suffering, you know, and that's just, you know, that's just a completely inaccurate way of it. It's just not true. And so I don't think I'm answering your question, Tristan. So I think you're going to have to get me back on track. But you just, in your comments, you raised a lot of thoughts in my head. But I think understanding reasonable compromise, and that reasonable compromise, it is in and of itself can't be defined, right? It might be defined generally, but it's going to have very specific application and meaning for certain animals and certain species, but certainly certain individuals. And that's where, if like for me as an ethologist, that's where the work is. How do we understand what is a reasonable compromise for the elephants that I work with, for the individual elephants I work with? What's, you know, for Moki May, the elephant, what is reasonable for her, right? In relationship with her elephant family, with her human family, because they are in relation with other humans. And so, and I've seen, and, you know, I've seen that, right? So I've seen the elephants, right, respond to their elephant guardians, you know, who communicate to them like, you can't really go in that cornfield, right? Yeah, they probably want to go in that cornfield and eat that corn, but their elephant guardian communicates. Just sometimes it's a hand on the head, on the neck. Sometimes it's a gentle tug in another direction, and the elephants get it. Do I think that leads to a lower state of welfare or well-being? No, I don't. I actually think in that context, that compromise comes through a relationship of reciprocity, and that leads to a higher state of well-being.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, wonderful.
So I don't know if I answered your question at all, Tristan.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
Let me just apologize again.
No, of course not. In some ways, it's a bit of an impossible question because, you know, you can't have some one ideal state that suits every situation or even every individual within a population. And even if you knew what the ideal state was, it might not be relevant. But I remember hearing Amartya Sen commenting on an argument he had with John Rawls. So John Rawls, in his theory of justice, comes up with this ideal social state, you know, and his idea was if we know what the ideal is, we can work towards it. But Amartya Sen came back and said, we don't need to know the ideal state to know that things can be better.
Right.
You know,
right.
we can make improvements from here and where we are without knowing exactly where we're going in every respect. And you know, there's a limit to the usefulness of understanding those ideals. So maybe there's a limit to those counterfactuals, and indeed the way you're talking about it, you know, looking at this elephant here now, what's going to be good for it in the future based on its social, ecological context and stories, maybe the best approach. Yeah.
Great. Adam.
Thanks. Wonderful talk, Liv, as always. And on the life worth living, I was just wondering whether it's just a bad way to say things. Like, you know, the life of the individual is probably good to the individual, but the context is not. And perhaps it's context worth living that we should actually strive for rather than life worth living, because the context can always change for many, many animals. We can move them into sanctuaries or remove the human restrictions on them in captivity. So I think it's just a shit way to frame it.
I agree. Yeah.
Well, the question I had is about the term well-being, and I really use it. I really like it, and I've been using it ever since meeting you and trying to sort of use it as a step change in thinking, as you highlighted in this presentation. But in the same way, I wasn't aware of that history of, but it makes a lot of sense now that you've showed it, of like the ethics being essential to where animal welfare science comes from, but then the welfare scientists just drop the ethics, right? What do you think this will happen with the concept of well-being, especially because when I've sort of used it, some people are like, oh yeah, well, well-being's already in the 5 domains, right? It's
Right.
in there at the last domain and it's already captured. So you're just thinking about it a bit differently, but we already do well-being. And then you get this, I don't know the organization that you folks were talking about earlier, but they're using well-being purposefully, but in a way that does not accord with your sort of presentation of well-being. You know, will well-being be captured and bastardized by other people, and how do you stop that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a question for all of us, right? I mean, yeah, you're already starting to see that it's being co-opted, right? But like in the examples that I mentioned in the slides and that you've all brought up, it's being used very vaguely, right? Sometimes just interchangeably with welfare, sometimes to the, Stephen's, point about, well-being in the zoo world. Sometimes it's being used because, the humans that are reading this will just understand, like, welfare is well-being. So now you understand what welfare is. Okay, let's just keep, same thing, same old thing, keep going, right? So it's the infusion or the use of well-being, I should say, I haven't seen any real change in practice and approach yet. And, similar to how the zoo world co-opted compassionate conservation, right? Oh, well, we've always been doing compassionate conservation from day one. We're the most compassionate conservationists. Again, none of the practices or policies were altered. It was just, stamping this new thing onto the old. So I think, yeah, that's what we're seeing now. And so I'm not sure I have a good answer, so I'd be curious to hear what you all think about ways to sort of shield us from the planing, the disintegration, all of that might happen as a result. I think it's going to happen to some degree no matter what, because that's just the nature of things. But I think the messaging about that with well-being, especially not that it needs to be a science of animal well-being, but if we were to keep it in that juxtaposition with animal welfare science, then to me, what's important is to say, well, as a science of animal well-being, what's leading it is this ethical approach. That is what shapes everything. So that needs to be at the fore almost all of the time to prevent the erosion that happens so quickly with animal welfare science. It's like with animal welfare science, it happened so quickly. It was almost like it never had the chance to be more than it has become, right? Like thinking about like Ruth Harrison and Astrid Lindgren and people like them who were, way more radical than animal welfare science so quickly became. And they just, those voices got sort of silenced really quickly. And so instead they're used as like ambassadors or, right, but, the photo, but not the substance is often what's, trotted around.
Let's come back to that question in the after party. There's some really interesting things to talk about there. Fred.
I'm sort of going to build on that. First of all, having worked in zoos for 15 years, I think that, it's a little unfair to act like there's not been any incorporation of better standards for animals.
Oh, and I agree with you. I don't I don't
Yeah.
believe that at all. Of course, there's been improvement, and yeah. And actually, and let me just say before you you go on, Fred, there's so much amazing knowledge in the zoo world that I sometimes actually like kind of lament that it has like we don't have more access to all of that amazing knowledge and information and experience, and that it's the zoo world sort of sometimes closes ranks and protects itself, but there's a huge amount to learn from people in the zoo world. So, and I've been zoo adjacent for a really long time, so it's hard to anyway. But go ahead. Please.
Yeah. So what I wanted to say was, and to start, obviously, is that the whole animal welfare in both zoos and universities, IACUC committees. I mean, it really was all about justifying the use of animals. And I think sometimes, like, I can say this because you like elephants. I think the elephant in the room really is the anthropocentric point of view. And, it's really, we're trying to find ways to justify animals, the use of animals.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the problem is the human animal divide has become blurry. We had to sort of keep upping the game of how we were justifying it. And what I saw in the zoo world was that, it was first easier to see the animal divide breaking down in things like primates, gorilla. I mean, you can't not look at a gorilla exhibit in a zoo and not say, like, wait a second, there's something wrong here. And so, what happened is back in the 80s, we started talking about the psychological conditions. So we started developing things like behavioral enrichment. And I think out of this really was why zoos started to tend towards using well-being, because it was like they thought that the well-being, then the difference between welfare was how big do you build the crate that you ship the animal from the Bronx Zoo to St. Louis? And how, and then it was the nutrition you feed the animals. And, what do you feed a fruit-eating monkey compared to a leaf-eating monkey? Anyway, so then back to the story. So the story then evolved into, the psychological, there was something beyond these kind of requirements, and it was the psychological requirement. So I do have a fear that, well-being, unless we can really change that anthropocentric viewpoint, how do we change the viewpoint that, as you so well put in your presentation, which was great, by the way, the agency of the animal. So I want to tell you a story that I found very interesting the last week. Okay, so in Washington State, there's a fishing show on Saturday mornings, okay? And it's just how you would imagine, these guys go out bass fishing or whatever, whatever. But last Saturday, what was unusual was that they went razor clamming. Okay, I don't know if you know what a razor clam is,
I do,
but in Washington State, it's a big deal. It's a clam, and they open the season a couple times a year, and literally thousands of people go down to the beach, and they dig in the beach right with the tides going out, and they get their razor clam. So here's the story that I thought was interesting. So this biologist was from the Fish and Wild was showing these people how to do it, and they dig up the clams, and they got some, and they put them in their bag. You get to take 15 home, and they laid them out on the beach. And sure enough, this one clam, the foot came out, and it started digging down to escape. And the one woman who was never gone clamming before, she goes, "Look, it's trying to escape." And what was fascinating was the biologist right away grabbed it and said, "Oh, it can't escape." But the point is that it made a big impression on me, because so often this idea of like well-being and ethics, again, the animal divide, it's like, where is the blurriness? Where is it that we have to, go to? And we brought up today about invertebrates, but that made me realize that, like, what is the good life? To me, it's just about being able to express yourself. And, this razor clam to me, had the agency. It wanted to live, it wanted to live by digging back down in the sand. And, and to me, like well-being, that's why I said before, like to me, it's about being free-willed. To me, maybe that's the right word. And sorry if, we have to live with this illusion of free will, but it's the best thing we have.
Yeah.
Is that, let animals express what, literally millions of years of evolution have brought them to, and what they're, as Tinbergen was the father of ethology with moderates, what they said was that, you build out these 4 principles. So to me, that's what somehow in the whole well-being, we gotta break this whole human-centric and start thinking like, well, what is the language? What is the domains that express what the individual expression of their entity? What is that? What are the words that express that? But anyway, it was a great talk, and it's so important because it goes well beyond. It's like everything is about this. What is the right? Well, everybody on this group knows it, but what is the right use of animals? Is there any right use of animals that we share a community with?
Right.
Anyway, great stuff. Loved
Thanks,
it.
Fred. Thanks for sharing that story. Oh, can I just add? Before it brought to mind. I won't. I'll sort of take away some of the details just to protect some people, but these were captive chimps, and they had undergone over a number of years a lot of or some regular social disruption. Some individuals had passed away, some were taken away, moved to other places, some were introduced. So we started to look at self-expression over time. And what we were starting to see was that certain individuals were masking, right? Were retreating into themselves. So we had started to look at personality measures, we had some prior data information before social disruption, different, along a long time scale. And after all this social disruption, the personality of certain individuals was, they were retreating, and self-expression was being lost. So there's real, impact to these conditions and what they're exposed to.
So I have this question. I since the 1990s, I've been using the concept of well-being to get around the fights about rights, rights, duties, and virtues. And there's this whole tradition of well-being thinking in the human arena that mirrors so much of the discussions that you've shared with us that have gone on in animal welfare science and animal well-being science.
Why
It's
did I give a
remarkable.
talk? We could have just read a paper about humans. Why?
No, absolutely
No,
not. But
I'm
there are these real parallels, and I wonder how much in animal welfare science, how much they're drawing upon theories of human welfare, especially in the biological and physiological measurement stages of that. So, for example, those are the dominant ways you think of human welfare. There is, however, the eudaimonic perspective, which is much more what you're talking about, flourishing, and the flourishing and the well-being of those lives as they're living them. Which really speaks to where this concept of well-being comes from. It's rooted in an old English translation of the Latin Greek use of the term eudaimonia. And it's related to welfare, to commonweal, to weal, to flourishing, etc. They were all efforts to try and translate into various languages that have come down to us this idea of eudaimonia. How do you think about that? Have you interfaced with this sort of the human concept and the ethical concepts of well-being?
Well, just to answer your first question, Bill, or the first part, in terms of how this knowledge or information or approach in the human world, has it permeated into animal welfare science? I don't know if I'm rephrasing in a way that loses the meaning of your question, so correct me if I'm wrong. I would say yes and no. When it's useful, then it's referred to. When it's not, it's dispensed. Oh, well, we can't extrapolate. That's ridiculous. We would be jumping to conclusions. So, I mean, that's largely what you see, right? You know, even in the way you see well-being peppered into things. When it's useful, great. Okay, it achieves this, you know, again, human driven, you know, incentive. But then when it doesn't, the depth, you know, collectively. Now, of course, there's going to be, you know, a piece or something written here, a study there, you know, that does achieve that. But overall, you know, taken all together as the field, no, it's totally cherry picked and at the convenience and, you know, in the service of whatever. Yeah. So you don't see, it's not, yeah, nothing in depth.
So
right, to really
specious
explore that.
appropriation of a domain of knowledge for their own purposes.
Yeah, and so, you know, and certainly there's specious too. You will see way more of it for primates, and then as we go, you know, farther away from species we're related to, then you see less of that for sure. Then it's like, oh, it's a mystery, you know. The other thing about eudaimonia is, you know, maybe I think we've talked about this before. Like it's not so much a criticism, but it's definitely like an observation I've made and a concern I have is how it's led to, right, the hedonic model, you know, in that we're focusing on, you know, happy, you know, in human psychology, it's happiness, you know, are humans happy? Well, what does that mean? Finns are the happiest, you know, country, you know, what is it? Citizens out there. But again, what does it mean to be happy? And so I think there's a problem when we focus on those, you know, sort of pared down, you know, domains of emotion or personality or affective state or however you want to think about it. And I think there's sometimes I see the use of well-being is sometimes interchanged with, you know, oh, that means you're happy, you're experiencing joy or a positive affective state, which is that in and of itself is such a narrow perspective on the life of an individual, right? To think like, am I happy all the time? No, none of us is happy all the time. Should we be happy all the time? No, of course we shouldn't be happy all the time, you know, but to live a life where you don't experience, you know, those positive emotions, you know, and those positive emotions so certainly, you know, probably outweigh, you know, more negative states, but what that proportion is going to vary again to an individual. So, but anyway, that I don't know if that answers your question.
It does answer the question, and I think it's a very important point to try and tease those things apart, especially because one of the reasons we associate eudaimonia with happiness as this hedonic model is because happiness was the word used to translate eudaimonia in the 1800s when utilitarianism was so big in the Anglo world.
Right.
And it has led to a misinterpretation of what folks meant back in the classical world, whether it was Eratosthenes, the geographer, or whether it was Aristotle or someone else, what they meant by the term eudaimonia.
Yeah.
I ask all these questions because I think it's important to talk about how it is we defend a particular view of well-being as you're articulating it. And
well, certainly
lines to do so, but you know, in the line that other people have been raising this question, how do we prevent the diminution of the term?
Right.
In the animal ethics, sort of the people who are talking about, you know, animal ethics in the way that I was framing it the other day, you know, in my presentation, they're directly taking from human ethics frameworks, which use well-being explicitly. Like that's all they use. They all about human well-being, and that's how we get these really complicated and, well, not so complicated, but very extensive models of how to do good human ethics. It's all based on well-being, and and I think a framing of well-being, a human well-being that's very similar to how you're thinking about animal well-being, Liv. But I have to head off. That was wonderful.
Okay,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Adam.
Have a good one,
Good to
folks.
see you, Adam.
I have a question related to that for you, Liv.
Yeah.
Have you asked that question that you had the discussion based on originally, which is the looking at that Venn diagram and what goes in the center? Have you asked that question in different groups of people? Because I'd be really curious, because it seems like this group was focused very much on the idyllic or like the perfect fit, like who has the very best life in all of that. And I wonder if some of the animal welfareists or veterinary groups or other groups where the standards are different and the way they relate to well-being are different would not strive as far towards perfection or idyllic circumstances in there.
Yeah, no doubt. The responses will vary based on who's being asked, where, you know, where they're coming from. Absolutely. And no, I haven't, but that's a great point. You know, Robin, like that would be a really cool question to ask different people. Yeah.
That's a cool study.
Yeah.
Not that I'm looking for cool studies at the moment, but that is
You've
the
got one of
question
your
I've
Come
been
on, Robin. We'll
Well-
expect the publication next week.
It is a question I've been weighing since actually I took a class with Chris on ethics with
Yeah.
wildlife rehabilitation and looking at that idea of perfection and again this discussion of disability and understanding a life worth living or something along those lines.
Your PhD, Robin.
Robin, say a little bit more about that. Give a little bit more context on that, because it's really rich and it's really important in this discussion. And I was hoping you were going to bring it up.
I mean, it really delves into that question of the way a life worth living is used and how we understand that. And I know that's really fraught, so I don't know if that really fits.
The example, for example, when, you know, decisions being made about who to kill because that human, you tell it.
Yeah, so in wildlife rehabilitation, it's frequently this animal has come in and is subject to a disability. It could be that animal is euthanized. It could be that animal is released and we hope for the best. And a lot of circumstances, it also could be that animal is put into a captive environment for the rest of its life. And so weighing that, because frequently wildlife rehabilitation is based on if that animal cannot reach perfection, we have to assume that it's not going to live a long and healthy life. And we don't generally have the knowledge to back it up because research is very, very few and far between as far as follow-up studies and, you know, is that further stress and like all those sorts of things too. So it's very difficult. And then I learned in doing that paper how much it varies by country, because I think it was Australia where one of the circumstances that would prevent you from releasing the animal would be if it was not reproductively viable, which is a whole other like complicated level of ethics. So yeah, that's one of those like, what is the best circumstance when we really don't know? We really can't say what, because you know, the disability could be very, very unique to that individual, and you are not going to see that anywhere else and be able to make generalizations from other experiences.
It's hard enough with humans to determine, you know,
and we're historically bad at it.
We're historically bad at it. So, yeah.
And the
One of the
presuppositions, go ahead, Liv.
Oh no, I was just, one of the things I'll just, and this is my work with the elephants too, is really, and I don't want to get us too off track about the rehab situation, Robin. But one of the things that tends to happen is a projection of welfare state onto another, right? And without, and I don't want to even use knowledge, because I don't want to imply that we need to do research. It just means paying attention, right, to that individual, having, you know, whether you know them, you're familiar, or what, you're just have your senses open or whatever it is, right? But we sometimes will project, oh, that's bad, or that's good, or they're suffering, or they're this, right? When we have no basis of understanding. And I'll just quickly say, and I think, I know I've shared this story with others here, but with the elephants, so the elephants that we work with, because they're owned, right, and they're in relation with these with the community, the human community, and they're elephant guardians. One of the traditions that this indigenous culture has used to track elephants is what they call a drag chain, right? And it's a very long chain, and it's very light. Like I've conducted like gait analysis studies with them to see, is it affecting how they walk through the forest, how they navigate tough terrain? Do we see any abrasions? We don't see any of that. And, you know, and when I look at the weight of the chain, it's equivalent to wearing like a heavy charm bracelet. Like it's kind of like that, right? You know, sometimes it gets snagged. Oh, I need to like unsnag it, or, you know, but it's otherwise not that big of a deal, right? But there were some welfare groups that came to visit, and without any hesitation said, chain's bad. What you need to do instead is build a corral and put them in the corral so you don't need to use the drag chains.
Wow.
Now, what that would have meant for these elephants is they wouldn't be able to roam all over the forest, wherever they want to go. Instead, they would have to be restrained in their movements, kept back, because if they went too far, well, the guardians would have to go find them, bring them back to this corral, because you can't, you know, what are they going to build a new corral every night with new material? Like, that's not feasible. So in fact, that solution for that context would have led to way worse conditions for those elephants, way worse welfare, absolutely worse well-being, right? But that was just the protection. We see chains as bad, so therefore this is bad. You have to, and then not just leaving it there, but this is what now you need to do, right? And they would have been complicit, right, in a much worse life for these elephants. Like, I know one of those elephants would have busted through that corral every night. I mean, if I were an elephant, I'd be busting out. That's my personality. I couldn't handle that, right? And so, but when I think about like the rehab situation that you're talking about, you know, there's a lot of things involved there, but that's also what's going on, is sometimes we project onto these animals, oh, well, you have an injured leg or an injury that's probably not going to heal in such a way. So are you going to be so compromised that, you know, you wouldn't be able to survive? You know, but then, you know, I've seen tripod coyotes living out their lives, right? And, you know, and if they came into rehab, what decision would be made when we have evidence that, at least in terms of that individual, they were doing fine. They were hunting, they were mating. And so I think with the decisions that rehab facilities make, they're very complicated, right? Resources are extremely limited, you know, and so I'm not judging any of that. But when possible, if we can make decisions about who gets to live in a certain way on an individual basis, I mean, that would be the ideal, right? If we can, you know, not just make assumptions about disabilities based on our feeling or our sense of it, how it might be in a human population or what have you, but actually, you know, yeah, anyway.
So can we assume that the drag chain is an example of the reasonable compromise around agency and autonomy that
I
you
think
mentioned before?
that's a type of reasonable compromise. I think so. In that context, it leads to greater freedom for them. And so, and I think though the elephants that I know would choose that greater freedom than not have the drag chain on them. And again, it's, you know, but that's a drag chain, you know. It's like, oh yeah, sometimes it gets, you know, entangled in the vegetation and I have to, you know, lift it up with my trunk, or, you know, that's the level of compromise. And that seems Yeah, that seems like a reasonable one for greater freedom.
I love that example. I think that's a beautiful illustration of the point. Can I ask a question about the terminology? When you, is that,
Why it's called drag chain, you mean?
no,
Oh,
the
okay.
reasonable compromise
Uh-huh.
is, every time I hear reasonable compromise, I can't help but key in on the word reason. And is that coming from a specific place or?
No, and I'm open to better terms, but the reason I use reasonable compromise is just to mean that it's, it's an acceptable compromise from the individual having to make the compromise itself, but also acceptable from those who's asking for the compromise. I think it's multi-directional in that way, and it should be, right? And so, but
Agreed.
yeah, so that's, acceptable, reasonable. I'm open to
Just that
words,
reason,
but
that reason has been so tied to really the anthropocentric kind of this
right.
ethical traditions, particularly. Acceptable is the word that I was going to suggest. Yeah.
Yeah, are you thinking of the common law precedent stuff where it's like, what have we considered a reasonable compromise for?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's
animal welfare.
Well, partly, but I'm really thinking about more about, it's not really just about reason. It's about the relationship. It's about the intuiting. It's about what's acceptable under all of the circumstance, the context, the relationships, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Then this is one of the reasons why I disagree with that, because I think reasonable conjures the conversation where you give the justification in terms of reasons and evidence for your claims. So it's not just acceptable because the patriarchy says it's acceptable or this is the way we always do it. There's an effort of justifying with specific reasons, claims, specific evidence. And then you can distinguish what is a legitimate acceptable compromise and a non-legitimate acceptable compromise.
Well, a legitimate acceptable compromise then, or a
yeah. Well, I know where you're going. I know where you're going, but there's a way in which I react to an effort to try and sideline questions of reason.
I'm not sidelizing.
No, I know you're not. I know you're not. I know you're not. But I think it's important to raise that issue about why is it we say things like the importance of reason and evidence, because otherwise there's a way in which we can open ourselves up to reason more broadly understood, intuition, emotion, experience, etc. There's also a way in which we go, I don't need to provide claims and justifications for what I want to do. I just have to assert it's part of tradition, or it's the way I believe it ought to be done, or God says it's our right over animals, etc.
Absolutely. Totally agree.
Yeah, we're in agreement, I know.
I think this conversation is making me think about one of the conversations that was had was like, what is appropriate enrichment for animals? And so an example was, could we give Kongs, like the dog toy Kongs, to animals if that really gave them an opportunity to engage in species-specific behaviors? Or should we try to find some quote-unquote natural alternative to Kongs? And it kind of came up with this idea of like, is it more important, like what is actually promoting these animals' well-being, or is it more important that people who see it think it's promoting animals' well-being? But they're not going to have Kongs in the ocean to play with. So it was sort of this like, do we care more about what the public perceives as good animal welfare or well-being, or what is actually good animal well-being? Right. And so I think of these drag chains versus the enclosures. It's almost like enclosures look like better animal well-being.
Right.
They're not dragging along this unnatural chain. It's like I feel like it calls, and it kind of, I don't know, I really appreciate this idea of like, how do we prevent the co-opting of well-being, and make, like, how do, so like, I feel like an answer to that is partly just like, are we authentically empathizing with these animals and really trying to think about what their experience is versus are we just settling for what we think what we think seems like a good experience.
Right.
And so I feel like with the Kong, the example is like, would a sea otter genuinely prefer like a stick to something more contrived that doesn't look as natural, but is actually much more capable of giving them the opportunity to engage in their species-specific behaviors? And I feel like that's kind of that's one of the things is just, I feel like one of the ways it's sort of that, like, do we take that extra step of thinking, well, do we kind of challenge our own beliefs about what is good welfare or well-being?
Right.
Or do we kind of, okay, this feels good to me and I'm going to go home and feel good about it?
Right. Who are we doing it for? I think and like a captive setting it's an odd place to be focused on what's natural, right? And when so much of it is not, right? So much, and so and again, being zoo adjacent for so long, I hear about these conversations and the decisions that are being made, and it just is, sometimes it's just really baffling, when you could just educate the public, have signs talking about what we're doing here, what we're trying to achieve, what does this mean for these, I won't say the species, Stephen, what does it mean for these animals, right? And we're not just throwing enrichment at them, but we're trying to find stuff that's actually enriching, and that's what we're doing here, right? And it's just it's just a curious thing. And I know Bill knows the story, but you'll have to edit this out, Bill, so note the time too. But Stephen, this reminds me and the rest of you of a story where it was a zoo person that was justifying, in my estimation, a pretty abhorrent zoo practice. But in their justification was talking about how important, well, who are we to deny reproduction and breeding for these females? How dare we? How dare we compromise their welfare? And I didn't just think, I did speak to it, but I'm like, you're cherry picking what is important to their state of well-being, right? You're choosing reproduction over all of these other things that they're deprived of, and somehow you find that more important than these other I know, Bill, you know who this is, these other compromises. And so
I'm more reflecting on the patriarchal sensibility.
It is very patriarchal. Yeah, it's that too. Yeah, in terms of course a female would want to reproduce.
Yes, exactly.
But that's their call. That's what they're here. They're put on earth to do. Yeah. And that would trump anything else they might desire in the world and during their lifetime. But
I presume with that male that we're going to put into the enclosure with them,
right,
that they don't know,
that they don't know
from another zoo,
or forced
like
insemination.
I call it rape, but that's just me.
Yeah. So yeah, Stephen, like absolutely, I agree with that. And
but if we were to just pick a species out of the air, like let's say sea otters, we know of at least one sea otter who prefers surfboards and is training her children how to use them. And I think in part this goes back to what you and Liv are talking about, is the artificiality of imposing a rigid sense of what's natural in different conditions. It's not like there isn't nature out there and we can't make distinctions about more or less natural, but in these particular contexts and thinking about their welfare, not just appearances, maybe the Kong is the best thing. I'm sure there are Kongs in the garbage patch, and I'm sure on the way to the garbage patch, some sea otters have come across some Kongs. That's speculation, obviously, but I can imagine Kongs being evidentiarily really good and fun.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we have videos caught of, coyotes and foxes playing with quote unquote dog toys, right? When nobody's looking, you know,
Yes.
even though it's made of material that they wouldn't otherwise find. So, and that's, yeah.
There's
Yeah.
also been pushback on the species-specific behaviors and the natural behaviors in training. I know Steve Martin and I think Susan Friedman maybe have been pushing back on zoological facilities only training natural behaviors, because there's also enrichment in learning behaviors and having that progressing relationship with their keepers and everyone else around, that it, like, restricting yourself to only things that are species specific and can be reproduced in that environment is not necessary.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not in the natural environment, folks. I mean, I know this is, it's,
They're
They're
totally
not being
yeah,
released. So,
And then you get into the realm of like learning to be able to do, you know, safe blood draws and tooth exams. Those aren't natural behaviors necessarily, but they're going to be beneficial for everybody.
right.
Yeah, I guess I don't know. My immediate answer to be like, how do we prevent the co-opting of well-being was like, well, we just or be honest about like this term is being co-opted. Like it's not the same thing.
Right.
But then I guess my next thought though was like this idea of public trust, and the public trusts zoos. They trust aquariums as the expert in animal welfare or well-being or whatever term they choose to use.
Yeah.
And anybody who speaks out against that is a quote unquote radical who is, you know, guided by their emotion and not by their scientific background, even if they are the scientists who originally influenced. So
The one thing I will say in my very small sample size of zoo folks who have been interviewed by students for some classes of mine over the years is I have marked a change in, is transparency the right word? Am I going too far to say transparency? A bit of more, but at least being more open about things. You know, even like 4 or 5 years ago, it was, you know, you might as well have just gotten someone from the, you know, PR, HR department, whatever, you know, to come and speak. You know, it was so much like so scripted, so careful. And then, you know, in the last couple of years, even like, you know, I've had some directors of zoos being interviewed, and they're a little bit more honest, you know, if not fairly more honest about things. And it's maybe a small achievement or a small, you know, point of progression to note, but I'm still noting it because I think it at least speaks to why people are drawn, and you can, you know, maybe Stephen speak to this too, is like why people are drawn to work at zoos. Sometimes it's just like, well, I love animals and this is really the only opportunity that's out there, right? And that's often why people do research at zoos, because it's more convenient than, you know, going to Thailand and doing research or staying up at night and 18 hours a day for 6 months and doing work with Siemens kangaroo rat and burning yourself out and never recover. Anyway, I'm going on and on about it. But there's, you know, I'm like, oh, why didn't I just do my PhD at a zoo? I would have, you know, and my quality of life probably would have been better. But, you know, but I do think like there are people in the zoo world that I think have sentiments way closer to mine, you know, than not, but they're cautious, they're careful, they're, you know, and keeping their head down, and maybe over time they get converted. I don't know, maybe they still have the fight in them, I'm not sure, but yeah.
Liv, I have a question, and I'm going to speak a little softly because my husband's trying to fall asleep in the next room.
Sorry.
And I promised him I
knew it
wouldn't
got
do
late.
this, but I can't help myself. Rewilding. You talked about rewilding. So, and I remember the nested baskets of ecology, you know. What do we want to know about well-being in that kind of situation where animals are being released back into a quote unquote wild environment?
Yeah. So the how I study it, Chris, is So what has been controversial, because I would say the vast majority wouldn't refer to these elephants as being rewilded, right? Because rewilding has meant largely an ecological phenomenon, right? Almost like separate from the animal experience itself. But my approach is to center the animal experience in this ecological event of, here we are returning elephants to this native forest, but through my again, like my psychosocial ecological take on rewilding, it is trying to look at it from their experience, right? Essentially, how does, and also what I didn't get into it, I've also started to, working with the elephants has led me to rethink, like, what does it mean to be wild? And that's also part of my research. And how do we define wild? What informs being wild? And to me, that is a dynamic state, and that's also a psychoecological state. And so not necessarily a status of where you're born, but the life you're living and experiencing. So for me, that's how well-being folds into that, is sort of doing behavioral research with these elephants to determine how they're spending their days, with whom they're spending their days, how they're, engaging with their environment, where they're moving in their environment, and to see, to get at essentially a psychological state of well-being.
Okay. So I read an article that you wrote a while back about the stress that animals can go through when you try to relocate them from a habitat that they are familiar with. But they're being moved around because their habitat's shrinking, and they're trying to prevent extinction in other, sites and so on. And, but that, I suppose, gets to what you were just saying, that if the scientists who are moving these animals around aren't aware of that impact that it can have.
Oh yeah, that's why translocations have been notoriously unsuccessful, like a complete failure.
Yeah,
and that's largely because the experience of the animals was factored in. Yeah.
Well, folks, is this a good place to wrap up? Or Kimberly, it looked like you were just about to jump in.
I have a burning question.
Burning. All right, go for it.
I've been trying, but it's okay. But I'll try to keep it short, because I've been thinking about these things the whole time. But yeah, you said so much, and everyone has added a lot. And so, I don't know, it just leaves me thinking, Liv, and you've talked about this a lot in terms of research then and going forward and thinking about stakeholders. And do you see it really changing and maybe not existing in the way that it has at all? Because at the beginning, I was really thinking a lot about kind of presenting science in order to show different individual animals or species and all of their complexities, in order to kind of be able to use that approach and center them in their own lives. And as we sort of talked about it more, and Tristan was speaking and Adam, I was thinking more about, we're talking about, cherry picking science over on this end, and then over on this end, maybe not ever being able to know some things and that being okay. And so it leads me to, at some stage I say we jump to not just leading the research with ethics, but even going straight to the policy or wherever it needs to be, kind of knowing that we might not know, and using what we don't know just to, in order to be able to show who individuals are and all of their complexities, but in order to center them in their own lives, maybe that being the less important thing. And kind of Tristan talking about, we don't need to know the ideal state to know that things can be better. And so, like, what does it look like to present that in a palatable way? Because it seems to, at some point, it'll become less about those details if it isn't already intuitively apparent to people who see that these individuals deserve to live in with as much agency and autonomy as humans. And so going back to using that human model of what we see as well-being for humans. But I know that was a lot.
No. It was good. But I just want to make sure, because I feel like I'm not answering anybody's questions. So I just want to make sure that I hit the mark. So do you want to just help me out just to make sure that I know? Because
yeah. So the research piece, is it
Okay.
becoming less important? Not less important, but changing
Gotcha.
in a
Okay.
really significant way, and then presenting animals and centering them in a new way.
Right. So in a sense, I would say, in a sense, the research is less important.
Yeah.
It generally, right? There might be certain questions that are like, oh, this is important to find out. But I would say just like generally research, right? More research. It's not like, I would say, no, we don't need more knowledge or information to actually inform a lot of the decisions we are making now. Those decisions or choices or whatever could be made one with knowledge we already have, and for different reasons, right? And so that, like put me out of a job, or like let me change my job, that kind of thing, right? And I think, and maybe this is just my bias, in terms of why I do the research I do, but I just find the observation so fascinating, right? Just like, let me have the privilege of kind of watching and learning and, discovering from that, not through manipulation, not through intervention, and there's so much about the natural world and about other animals or just other organisms that we could learn in that way, right? And that's kind of just like being a citizen in the world, right? Like, oh, I have my senses open as I relate to all of you or whomever. And, I integrate information and I reassess and I repackage or whatever. And so we're kind of, doing little mini, right, behavioral observations all the time. And does that?
And I wish that was what everyone could see. And so it's like, getting that to them. But that was beautifully said. Thank you. And thank you for all of it. That was so wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks. It wasn't, I appreciate your kind words. I'm super sleep deprived, so my brain feels like complete mush. So I really appreciate, maybe that's why I spoke so slowly compared to how I usually am. So, but anyway, thank you all. I really appreciate it.
This was fun, folks. This was lots of fun. Thanks, folks. Really, really
Thank you.
appreciate this. PanThinks is a production of PanWorks, an ethics, science, and policy think tank for the well-being of animals. It is edited and produced by Gary Shear with the help of Bill Lynn. To learn more about PanWorks, visit our website at panworks.io. To donate to our work, please visit our support page on our website. Until next time, this is PanWorks, bringing ethics to life.